We were the 10-man crew of a B-17 bomber and had just finished 3 months of intensive work with an operational training unit at Kearney, Nebraska. The many hours spent in practice flights were highly productive. We learned to work together as a crew under the command of our pilot, who was named Jim Tyson. I was the navigator assigned to this team. However, practice flights were a thing of the past, and we started for the European Theater of Operations and Combat on Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 1943, flying a brand new B-17G numbered 237986. Our first stop was Syracuse, New York. We had a traditional Thanksgiving Day turkey dinner at the mess hall, but it wasn't quite like home. Our next stop was Presque Isle, Maine. This seemed like a good opportunity to practice some sunline celestial shots, so I asked Jim Tyson to fly from radio range to radio range while I practiced celestial observations. I made a few observations with my Fairchild A-10 octant, but had serious problems getting my sunlines to fall into place. This deeply concerned me, and I was trying my best to find the answer to my problems. Suddenly I heard the pilot call over the interphone, "Navigator, where are we?" The only thing I knew was that we were not on my plotted sunlines. I grabbed a pilotage chart and soon spotted our position not far from Bangor, Maine. I discovered the Bangor radio range station was off the air, so I plotted a course for Presque Isle, Maine, and put the octant aside for the rest of the trip. Bad weather grounded us 4 days at Presque Isle. The poor sunlines I had plotted deeply concerned me. I had never had any trouble calculating or plotting a line of position from a celestial shot. With the trip across the Atlantic staring me in the face, I figured it would be best to find out what had happened. I practiced shooting 3-star fixes for the next 2 evenings, but my results were horrible. Finally, I took the octant down to the base repair shop to see if it could be collimated. The technician found the octant was not at all accurate, but he had no repair facilities. A replacement Fairchild A-10 octant was issued to me, and my next series of 3-star fixes and moonshots worked out perfectly. On the last day of November, we finally got off the ground about 1100 hours and headed out across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. I couldn't help but feel a little peculiar as the coast of the United States faded in the distance. About 3/4 of the way across, we spotted Newfoundland stretched out before us. We sighted land about 1430. Almost immediately, we received instructions to land in Stephenville on the west coast. Gander Lake was closed in. I had an ETA of 1510 to Stephenville. Both Jim and I thought my calculations were wrong, and we would get in about 10 or 15 minutes early. It was so clear we could see the base and the hangars and the planes on the ground fully 1/2 an hour before my ETA. But we flew and flew, finally arrived over Stephenville Airport at 15:15, 5 minutes after my ETA. The distance and the clear air had really deceived us. We didn't think land was more than 40 miles away. Actually, it was 100 miles away. Due to our late takeoff from Presque Isle, we were next to the last ship to land. I stayed with the plane while the rest of the crew got situated. The gas truck came by and I filled the main tanks and calculated our consumption at 154 gallons per hour. It was cold on the ramp. When the rest of the crew returned, we made certain the ship was wrapped up with wooden port blocks in place in the exhaust stacks protecting the turbo superchargers. Then I went to eat while the rest of the crew sacked out. The next day was spent lounging around at the officers' club because there was a terrible storm blowing. Wind gusts reached 90 miles per hour, and the weather report mentioned blowing dust and rocks. The entire group had to stay an extra 2 days while mechanics cleaned out exhaust stacks and turbochargers on many of the ships on the line. Our crew didn't seem to mind the delay. The wooden blocks had protected our superchargers, so the crew did a pretty good job of investigating life in the town of Stephenville, Newfoundland. On December 4th, the weather report was good. We took off for Gander Lake about 1500 hours. It was only 150 miles. We arrived a little over an hour later and were the first ship in. Our group was named the Chambers Provisional Group after our commanding officer, Major Chambers. Gander Lake is a mighty big field. All kinds of planes were on the tarmac. Canadian and American planes were abundant. They ranged from C-54s to PBYs to Hurricanes. Since we were the first crew in, our ship went into the hangar first. Mechanics swarmed over it, fixing anything that needed fixing before parking it on a hard stand. Then began the Battle of Gander Lake. It started to snow. It snowed every day. For 16 days we were stuck in that place with nothing to do but sit and sleep and sit and sleep. Jim came down with a bad cold and was in the hospital most of the time. We spent most of our time just sitting and reading, going to the movies at the officer club, and just loafing. Our commanding officer, Major Chambers, showed up a couple of days after we arrived with a few other ships that had trouble getting clear of Stephenville. The snowstorm lasted more than 2 weeks. However, on December 17, 1943, it cleared, and the snowplows were busy clearing the runways. The briefing room was crowded with the 37 crews of the Chambers Provisional Group who were scheduled to fly their B-17 bombers to England. According to Metro, the weather was supposed to be fairly good with 30 to 40 miles per hour tailwinds helping us all the way. We were alerted to a front about 100 miles west of the Irish coast. I filled out my navigator's flight plan, drew in the route on my Mercator projection chart, grabbed the rest of my gear, and headed for the plane that was being pre-flighted by the crew. The gross weight of the B-17 was 58,000 pounds. Each member of the crew had a bedroll, a B-4 bag, and an A-3 bag tucked in the bomb bays. In addition, my navigator's footlocker was jammed into the small nose compartment. The fuel tanks, Maine and Tokyo, were filled again after the engines were warmed up. Fuel capacity was 2,750 gallons. Oil tanks were full with 36 gallons each. The number 2 plane wasn't ready to go, so we taxied down to take off position in his place. It was very cold and the snow was piled high on each side, but the plows had done a good job clearing the runways. I was wearing my electric suit and my regular wool pants as well as my fleece-lined flying boots over the electric boots. I ran a final check on my Fairchild Octant the previous day. Everything checked out fine. Everyone on the crew realized our chances were 0 if we were forced down in the Atlantic or became lost on the way across. I was not apprehensive, but I surely did not feel cocky. I had full confidence in my ability to navigate the ship and crew safely across the ocean. We were ready to go. However, if we could have foreseen what was waiting for us far out over the Atlantic, I'm sure we would have preferred to wait for more favorable conditions. The all clear for takeoff was received from the tower at 10 minutes after midnight. Just as Jim was running up the engines, a large trailer truck full of gasoline turned around in the runway intersection ahead of us. The words were hot and heavy as co-pilot Bill Doherty told the tower what to do with that fuel truck. Finally, at 21 minutes after midnight, Jim eased the throttles forward and we started for England. With snow piled high on each side of the runway, it seemed like we were taking off from the bottom of the Grand Canyon. The air was cold and dense, and the runway was about 7,000 feet long. After 2 or 3 bounces, we were airborne about 3/4 of the way down the runway. We made a wide sweeping turn and passed the airport, climbing on course at 28 minutes after the hour. We had never flown our ship at night before and discovered that my navigator's light reflected into the pilot's eyes. I stuffed my leather flight jacket up under the rudder pedals and remedied that situation. My chart was a small-scale Mercator covering the entire distance between Gander Lake and our objective, Prestwick, Scotland. We flew a great circle course because of the shorter distance and more favorable wind Metro claimed we would have by comparison with a rumline course. The stars were bright, very bright. I took my first 3-star fix about 1 hour after takeoff and got a ground speed of 174 knots. I had intended to use Polaris, the North Star, to determine our latitude, but I had problems. The night was so very clear, 3rd and 4th magnitude stars looked like 1st and 2nd magnitude stars. The field of view for identifying stars in the octant was quite limited. I could not positively identify Polaris, a 2nd magnitude star, in the midst of a background of unbelievably bright 3rd and 4th magnitude stars. Plans for using the North Star for latitude shots were abandoned. I used other, more readily identifiable stars such as Betelgeuse, Sirius, Dubhe, as well as the Moon. The concern of the crew about our position was obvious. The radio operator tuned in on a station that provided accurate time checks for celestial navigators. Sergeant Churchill volunteered his services in the nose of the ship to help the navigator. I handed him the chronometer and told him to watch the second hand and notify me immediately if it stopped. Churchill did his job well, and I was relieved of the responsibility of conducting a training school when I was somewhat concerned myself. The outside temperature was a modest -10 degrees centigrade or +4 degrees Fahrenheit. My 3-star fixes were falling into place, and the first part of the trip was more or less uneventful. I obtained position reports from celestial fixes at 0228, 0328, 0436, and a final fix at 0536. The ground speeds were 197, 196, 201, and 205 respectively. This speed was phenomenal for a B-17. We were being pushed along by a strong tailwind just a few degrees off the tail from the north. I was getting ready to take some more star shots about 0620 when the pilot called. He told me to put on my oxygen mask as he was climbing to get over some clouds. Churchill went back to the radio room. By the time we got things rearranged in the nose of the ship and my mask in place, it had closed in all around us. This was the front the meteorologists had told us to expect. We still had about 800 miles to go. I put the octant away and kept track of our course by dead reckoning. We were homing in by radio compass on a strong radio beam at Durna Cross, Ireland, and expected to fly out of the front within 30 minutes to an hour. The temperature was minus 20 degrees centigrade, and we were flying smoothly at 16,700 feet. My ETA to Derniercross was 0841. About 40 minutes out of Derniercross, the radio compass started to swing violently and had to be disregarded. We knew the storm was affecting the signal. We flew up my ETA by dead reckoning, still confident we would clear the front, as Metro said we would. Derniercross was equipped with an ADO ray to navigation called a marker beacon. This was a very high-frequency radio that transmitted a cone directly above the station. When a plane equipped with a marker beacon indicator flew through that cone, a red light mounted on the dash in front of the pilot lit up. When the red light in front of Jim Tyson lit up just a few minutes after my ETA to Derniercross, he knew that we were on course and on time. He picked up my new heading for Prestwick without hesitation, but we were still flying in the clouds. Jim decided to go down and take a look below. We dropped to about 12,000 feet and hit some very bad icing conditions. 1 minute the black perforated outer barrel of the machine gun sticking out the starboard navigator's window was merely a shadow in the dim light. The next minute it looked like a huge white war club. Ominously, the airspeed indicator dropped to 0 because the heater in the pitot tube had failed. Jim applied power climbing to try and find an altitude where icing conditions weren't so severe. He flew by power settings from that point on. For the navigator, there were no stars, radio signals, or power settings to turn to. All I could use was data from my last 3-star fixed position, already 2.5 hours ancient. The wind was stronger than any I had ever observed from my navigator's table. I used this to plot our position by dead reckoning. The engines groaned as we climbed on our northeast course to Prestwick. We finally broke out on top at 26,500 feet. Radio's reception had been very poor, but cleared when we broke out of the clouds. The air was cold, minus 45 degrees centigrade, or minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. My ETA to Prestwick was 0927. After we flew it out, I put the pilot on a corrected circle course so the wind wouldn't blow us out of the country. There was nothing else to be done. I sat quietly and listened to the radio as Jim tried to contact the Prestwick Tower. Jim could make contact with both Nuts Corner and Prestwick, but they wouldn't respond when he asked for a QDM, or magnetic heading to their base. Finally, after trying fruitlessly for about 30 minutes, he made another call to Burton, the code name for Prestwick, saying, "Hello, Burton. This is Harry Howe," which was our code name. "Come in, please." The response was loud and clear in a Cockney accent. "Hello, Harry Howe. Where are you?" Jim replied, "We don't know. What is the ceiling over your base?" The Cockney accent came back again saying, "Hello, Harry Howe. Where are you?" Jim replied, "We still don't know. What is the ceiling over your base?" Once more Prestwick came in with, "Hello, Harry Howe. Where are you?" Finally Jim replied, "Burton, this is Harry Howe. We don't know where we are. We're sitting up here at 26,500 feet above a solid cloud layer in the vicinity of your field. We are low on oxygen and running low on fuel. Our airspeed indicator isn't working, and we're losing number 4 engine to low oil pressure. Unless you can give us some help in the next 30 minutes, we're going to bail out and leave this SOB sitting up here." The response was immediate. "Hello, Harry Howe. Don't do that. Fly 180 degrees and give us a long count. Jim went through the ritual of counting slowly up to 10 and back to 1 again. About 1 minute later, the tower operator came back saying, Fly 270 degrees and give us another long count. Just a few moments later, he was back on the air with, Come on down, Ariel, you are right over the base. At that moment, the happiest navigator in the entire 8th Air Force was sitting in the nose compartment of a B-17 numbered 237986. Despite several queries by Jim, the tower operator had never given us the altitude of the cloud layer above the field. We were all goosey about going through the same bad icing conditions we had encountered earlier. Finally, after descending through 10,000 feet of solid clouds without icing, we broke into clear air at 16,000 feet. We marveled at the beauty of the English countryside spread out below us. The temperature soon rose above freezing, and the ice melted on the pitot tube. The airspeed indicator started working again, and our spirits soared. Prestwick was a fantastic contrast to Gander Lake. Gone were the piles of snow and the snowplows. Everything was green, lush, dark green, and damp with moisture. It looked much like New England in late spring, except the trees were bare of leaves. Dozens of aircraft were scattered about the airfield, everything from Typhoons to an old gypsy moth trainer biplane that looked at least 20 years old. We grabbed our bags and started for our quarters, but we couldn't get into our rooms until after supper. I sat down in an easy chair in the lobby of the VOQ and promptly fell sound asleep. I was pooped. About 4 hours later, I became aware that someone was moving my legs. I awakened to find a scrub woman on her hands and knees lifting each leg gently while she scrubbed the floor. I was quite flabbergasted, since I had never before seen a scrub person in any establishment get closer to the floor than the end of a mop handle. It was dinner time and I was famished. After eating, we went upstairs to our room. We all went to bed early to try and make up for lost sleep. After breakfast the following day, we were given a short briefing on our flight to Wharton. This is a small town located about 40 miles north of Liverpool. It had a large aircraft modification center located nearby. All planes arriving from the United States were modified with British radio systems. Command radios had suppressors mounted, limiting range to 10 miles to prevent overlap of radio chatter. There were 126 airports in wartime England and as many as 10,000 planes in the air at the same time. Other modifications included installation of an IFF, or Identification Friend or Foe radio, and a brand new piece of navigation equipment known as the G-Box. During this briefing, we learned that 3 planes from the Chambers Provisional Group were lost while crossing the Atlantic. The first was piloted by Carlisle Craig, who trained at the Kearney Operational Training Unit with us. He sent out a mayday and crashed into the Atlantic. All 10 crew members were lost. These included 2 close friends. The navigator was a sharp fellow named Richard Hargrove, and the bombardier was a swell guy named Bob Baum. A second plane crashed in southern Ireland, and there were 6 casualties. However, we did not know the pilot or any members of this crew. The third plane was an enigma. No mayday was set out, and neither the pilot nor radio operator sent messages indicating they were having problems. They simply took off from Gander and disappeared. Shortly after noon, we took off in our B-17 and flew down the west coast of Scotland and England, landing at Wharton, a small town just north of Liverpool. Flight time was about 1 hour. Later that day, the bombardier Frank Palahniuk and I walked about 3 miles to the town of Kirkham to catch a train to Blackpool, the Atlantic city of England. We went to a dance at one of the many pavilions, danced with lovely girls, and had a great time. But war is hell. We had to get back to the base. It was an hour after midnight when we arrived at the BOQ, where I found a notice to be ready to move out at 0500 hours. I packed my duds and left word with the orderly to call me at 0430. We spent the next 10 days at an Army redistribution center in Stone, Staffordshire. 2 days after Christmas, we received our orders assigning us to the 535th Squadron of the 381st Bomb Group at Ridgewell. The air base was one of 126 in wartime England and was situated about 35 miles southeast of Cambridge in East Anglia. We were replacements for some of the 9 crews and 90 men lost to enemy action by the 381st Bomb Group during December 1943. Our squadron commander was a fine fellow named Major Roy Halsey, but our living quarters were drab, cold, tin shacks called Nissen huts in England and Quonset huts in the United States. The day of our arrival at the base, a turncoat called Lord Haw Haw was broadcasting from Berlin. He welcomed us by name to England along with many other members of the Chamber's Provisional Group. He assured us we would all soon be dead or shot down and captured as prisoners of war. The threats didn't bother us, but we were shocked at the breach of security. Several weeks later, we learned that our third lost plane made a serious navigation error. They failed to detect the strong tailwinds from the northwest pushing them across the Atlantic and were hundreds of miles south of course. When they requested landing instructions over a German airport in the Brest Peninsula, an alert English-speaking tower operator gave landing instructions. They wound up as prisoners of war, and Lord Haw Haw and the Nazis gained access to our orders, as well as the name, rank, and serial numbers of the 148 officers flying in our group. As may be seen, we had a very interesting introduction to the 535th Squadron of the 381st Bomb Group of the 8th United States Air Force in England.